Hi, welcome to Color Speak. It's Janet Huxley, and today I have a special guest with me. She is here for us in this time, in this moment in history, because she is here to help us heal. Our God has a way to help us heal, and never before has it been more obvious that we need what she offers. Veronica Thompson is a licensed clinical social worker, trauma therapist, and committed Christian with more than 20 years of experience helping children, teens, and families heal from the effects of sexual abuse and trauma. She is also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse herself, which gives her a rare combination of professional expertise and lived empathy. As a Master of Science in social work from Columbia University and with a background that bridges psychology, law, and Christian faith, Veronica speaks thoughtfully about how trauma affects the mind, body, and spirit, and how biblical truth and sound clinical practice can work together in the healing process. And I know that you will be so blessed by what she has to say. Welcome to the show, Veronica.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here.
I'm grateful to have you. Tell me more about you. What did I miss?
There's a lot in there. I think I would say that I'm someone who grew up with what we call in the therapy world complex developmental trauma. So let me say a little bit about what that is, and then that will give some context to the way that I grew up. So there is a very important study called the ACE study. And ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Adverse means basically just means harmful. So harmful childhood experiences. And I want to tell you the story about that study. So there was a doctor who was actually working in an obesity clinic, and he was working with a woman who was weighed a bit over 400 pounds, and she was trying to get down to a healthy weight. And so she did this program, and they got her through this program to 130 pounds. And the doctor, as he tells this story, he says, we thought we have solved this problem of obesity. This is the program to do. Um, and then something happened that really surprised them. So she was out of the study for a while, and when she came back to the check-in, she had gained all of the weight back in a shorter time than it took for her to lose it. And so they said, what in the world happened here? And so they did an interview with her, and it turned out that she had been sexually propositioned by an older man at work, and that she had gotten triggered. And this triggered her to, and all of those symptoms came back that she had been dealing with that ended up causing her to become obese in the first place. And so they said, all right, let's figure out what's going on here. What's this about? And so they did a study, and it was enormous. And it was, I think, 17,000 people participated in this study. And they discovered that there are 10 harmful childhood experiences that are connected with a whole host of negative outcomes later in life. And those outcomes, they cover every domain of life. So these 10 experiences decrease longevity, so you're a risk for early death. It increases your risk of being an IV drug user by 4,600%. So just astronomically off the charts. All chronic illnesses, cancer, obesity, diabetes, all of these conditions, there's an increased risk of victimization later in life, difficulty with intimate relationships, increased mental health issues. So these 10 experiences were physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, and physical and emotional neglect, divorce, incarceration of a family member, mental health issues, unaddressed mental health issues, addiction, and domestic violence. Those were the 10. So by the time I got to high school, I had experienced all 10 of those experiences.
Mm.
So my first year of high school, I it was, I think, the second week of school. I had come from a neighborhood where, let's just say that, my neighborhood was a lot of powerless people. And so my second week of high school, there was an incident at school that I got blamed for that I did not do. So I was blamed for this thing and I was expelled when I was 13 years old and I was placed in an alternative high school program. And so I went to school 2 hours a day and then I was in this neighborhood where just all of these incredibly traumatic things were happening every day to everybody. There was drugs, there was violence. And so during this time, I just spent so much time in prayer because I had had the experience before I got to high school where I lived with my grandparents for a few years, and they were church-going people. And so I met Jesus and I was all in. Unfortunately, I couldn't find Jesus in my environment when I was in high school, but he lived in my heart. So that really I just prayed all the time for deliverance from that situation. When I was 16, I got pregnant and I had my daughter, who is amazing, and I'm so grateful for her. Um, so when I finished high school, I didn't know what God was going to do with my life. I had no idea. And it's funny because I think a lot of times now in my life, I pray for sort of specific things. I say, God, can you help me with this and that, or open this door? And I just find it really funny because during this time, I was like, God, I don't know. I have no idea how I'm going to get out of here, but can you open a door somewhere? I don't know what to do. I have no goals. I have no vision. I have nothing. Just please help me. And so God really I just found myself in these places where, someone who had had my experiences, it was just so unlikely that I would ever end up in these places. But I think what God did was he set me out on a path to really understand what was happening and why it was happening, um, and to help me heal so that I could, and I think that this is, for all people who are healed through Jesus Christ, I think it's our responsibility to then, once we have reached some sort of healing, that we then turn and help other people heal. So that's kind of where I am in my journey today.
Wow, that's amazing. You certainly picked yourself up by your bootstraps and made a great success of your life, which I think is probably an anomaly, it sounds like, from the neighborhood in which you were raised and came
Mhm.
out of. If you don't mind me asking, where were your parents in all of this?
So I had actually, so what therapists call this is disrupted attachments. And so I'm going to frame what that means. So my parents had gotten a divorce when I was 4. I think I was around 4 or 5, maybe, because I was in kindergarten. So when they got a divorce, they both kind of disappeared for a while, and my siblings and I lived with my grandparents.
Mhm.
And we were there, I think, for about 4 years. And then my dad came back. He picked us up. We moved to Texas. We lived with him for a few years, and then we moved to Connecticut with my mom. And my mom is, and this is important, I think, for when we think about generational trauma, my mom had experienced all of those adverse events as well.
Mhm.
And so, what I think, and I think my mom did a better job of dealing with those things than her mom did. And that's probably just continues down the line. And with my daughter, you can imagine I was 16 when I got pregnant. So I was very young and I was very traumatized. And so I made mistakes with my daughter as well. And so I think she was doing the best that she could with us, but she just had her own unaddressed trauma, and she just didn't know how to keep us safe. She
Mhm.
didn't know how to create boundaries with people. She didn't know how to give us structure. And so that's something that I think generationally, my mom and my daughter and I, we have conversations about, how do we just keep getting better? How do we keep trying to heal so that we can, progress toward the kingdom of heaven? But my dad, he kind of got remarried and had another daughter, and he was very busy with that. So we didn't see him very often. And yeah, and I think my mom was around, but again, she just didn't create a safe environment.
Mhm. Those are the same sorts of conversations that my kids and I have had.
Mm.
So in moving forward into just getting a real assessment of and being real about what the world looks like today and how we do deal with this and how you, as a therapist, are able to help those in need. I loved that this was a God drop. I told you off air. I really felt like when your agency contacted me, I had just come off last week of basically the better part of the week having been spent listening to the Mike Winger report, the abuses in the church, which have been, boy, they've been exposed particularly well over a lot of years. But I just feel like things are really heating up when you feel like, there's so much exposure on so many different levels in every single place. It seems like there isn't any one place that our God isn't just pulling up the stone so that we can see all of the vermin underneath there and kind of deal with it as we may. And I also want to just say up front that it was triggering for me. Now, I have, in a minute, I'll tell you why, but I have friends on both ends of the spectrum. I have friends who say, you know what? I don't want to know anything. I'm not called to know anything. I have, my God tells me I'm not supposed to know anything.
Mhm.
And I understand there's this idea that I embrace as well that back in the day when we all lived in villages, all we knew is what we knew within that confine. There were parameters set for us. And that wasn't such a bad thing because it kept us well mentally. And now we're in a place where we all know too much.
Mhm.
But at the other end of the spectrum is me who says, okay, even though I realize the benefits of, in some cases, not delving into this, that's not where I have been called. And as a journalist, I've always been acutely aware of those things. Moreover,
Mhm.
if I'm going to have guests on my show, I take responsibility for the people that come on my show. I take
Mhm.
responsibility for those that I advocate for. And I think the church has long missed that part of it, which is what the hullabaloo was about last week
Mhm.
when certain people were exposed because they didn't call out those who were abusing. In other words, the focus has always been on the cover up culture has been particularly over time and in recent days,
Mhm.
all about protecting the abuser, not the abused.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, there's some culpability there. And I spent last week thinking, well, that's why I keep a pretty tight circle in my
Mhm.
life of those people that I can truly trust because, and here's where the trigger comes in. We've all felt that. I've been in churches where wrongly or rightly accused, someone is out because of something said inappropriate. And then on the other end of the spectrum, church bodies I've been in where the pastor has been found to have porn on his computer and the elders are engaged in extramarital affairs and on the list goes. So therefore, it isn't any small wonder that people are running from the church as we navigate our own lives filled with this stuff. We think that the church is a safe place,
Mhm.
and it turns out it's not.
Mhm.
And as you and I discussed earlier, within my own marriage, I found that it wasn't what I thought it was. And the atrocities there were enough to just kill me, honestly.
Yeah. Mhm.
And I had to go through my own process of healing. So that's why I say it's triggering. So let's start there with so much has happened, even within the last couple of weeks, where so many of our viewers today are probably thinking, who do I trust anymore?
Mhm.
What does that look like? And I know that was one of the things that you talked about early on is just having you're a safe place for people to come and heal. And that's what our
Mhm.
God does is provide that.
Yeah, and I think our God is really has been paving a way for us to deal with these issues. The word trauma is pretty disseminated in our culture. Everybody kind of has some sort of, idea of what that means at this point. And I think that's how God works. He works, he heals and loves and creates connections with those who are suffering. A lot of people put this the addressing child sexual abuse and sex trafficking in the same sort of category as how God healed slavery in our country, which is, he went and penetrated the slave culture and you so many people who were slaves during that time became Christians and then, passed that on to their children. And so there's a generational impact of that. But at some point, there has to also be a structural intervention. So we have to be able to create laws and policies and that sort of thing. And I understand people like who you're giving examples of who say, I'm just not called to go there. And I've had people say that to me as well. And I do understand that, there's a body of Christ and we all have our own unique purpose and contributions to make to that. Um, and so if that's not a person's specific heart calling, I think that that's okay as long as there's a support system and some way of engaging when it happens. But I think part of the problem is that perpetrators, and one of the ways that I think that God has sort of shined light on this is with the Jeffrey Epstein stuff that's going on. And, people don't know who that is. Most people do. But if you don't, he is a billionaire who was working with lots of other wealthy people. And he was sexually abusing minors and trafficking those minors to other people. And so I think a lot of people have had real reactions to that. People are really upset that there hasn't been justice for these women and that these people have not faced accountability. And I would say that God is really kind of holding up a mirror to us to say, yeah, that this is what's going on. And it's not just going on out there in the world, it's also going on in your communities, in the Christian community. This is happening all the time. And so we really have to have some sort of understanding of this. And I think that God is revealing that in this time.
Mhm.
But I think one of the things you were mentioning is the church safe and these questions. The thing about perpetrators is that one of the things that makes it really difficult to deal with perpetrators and child sexual abuse is that I think we have a tendency to think that evil is out there. It's the Jeffrey Epstein of the world.
Mhm.
And we just know from the Bible that's not the case, that everybody has the capacity for evil. We just have to, have a relationship and choose to do God's will. But perpetrators are going to come into our lives, and they do. And so the numbers, if you look, are, 25% of females are sexually abused, 20% of males. That is a very large number of people. So I'll tell you how.
And let me interrupt you though, but that figure to me sounds low.
Yes, it is. Yeah. I was going to say those are the reported cases. And so
Right.
there's probably a much, much higher number of people. And I can say that because I feel very passionate about this issue and I work with survivors, and I know that silence and pushing it into the darkness is so harmful.
Yeah.
I kind of go around and just, whenever I join Bible studies or groups, I say, hi, I'm Veronica, and I say a little bit about myself, and then I say, I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I want people to understand that it's okay to say that. There's no shame to it. But because I do that, I will say that 9 times out of 10, people respond, somebody else says, me too. Yeah, I am too. So I think it's really important for us to talk about these things. But the reason that it's so difficult, and in my case, I was very, very young when I first began to experience sexual abuse. And it was my uncle in my family. And my uncle had become disabled from a car accident, so he lived with my grandparents. So I mentioned before that I lived with my grandparents for a while after my parents split up. Now, my grandparents were Christians. They went to church 4 times a week, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday morning, Sunday evening. They were prayer warriors. They were just engaged with the word and everything. And I think they did, the time that they had us, they raised us in that way. We prayed before every meal. We had a Christian household. But I think the problem was that they loved their son and they knew he was doing this. And but they couldn't face it because it was their son who they loved. And so he ended up doing damage to a lot of people, excuse me, in my family. And here's part of the problem. One of the symptoms of PTSD is negative conclusions about the world and yourself. So, excuse me.
Mm.
So because I was raised in this environment where there were a bunch of Christians around, we were living a Christian life, we were going to church, and my grandparents knew what was happening and didn't do anything about it. The conclusion that children come to in those situations is there's something wrong with me. It's okay if somebody harms me in this way. Nobody's going to do anything about this. Nobody cares. Um, this is just something that I have to deal with. So, and it's part of these conclusions that are drawn in these abusive environments are one of the things that leads to PTSD. And so by the time I got to my adult life, my teenage life, those were conclusions that I had drawn about the world and about myself and about how things were supposed to go that that then caused that re-victimization that I was mentioning before. So once you have these things happen to you, you're at risk later for re-victimization. And I think that it's sort of the same with what's going on in the church.
Yeah, I agree.
Evil's not out there, that we can point to it and just say, oh, this guy on the news, he should have all these consequences and it's terrible. Evil is something we have to look at in our own families and in our own communities, and that is very difficult. It takes real spiritual warfare to be able to say to somebody that you love, I have to call the police and we have to report this. And, I have to prioritize this child's safety over my relationship with you. That's really hard for people to do. And so what a lot of times ends up happening is that children become scapegoated. So it's the perpetrator that is supposed to feel shame because it's the perpetrator who is committing this evil. And so instead of all of those consequences going on to the perpetrator, feeling shame, and then on the other side of that, hopefully being able to recognize the harm that was done and repent, instead of that happening, all of the consequences go to the child.
Mhm.
And I think that's what people don't understand. People think, oh, if we can just move on from this, I have to tell you, I would say 75% of my clients just say, well, my parents were just kept saying, can we just move on? It's like, I don't want to deal with this. But the thing about it is that we live in a Christian country and we have a Christian system and the laws are a reflection of our Christian values. And so our system in America is meant to lead the perpetrator and the child to healing. And I can explain a little bit about what I mean by that. So when you have, so our system is set up that we believe that everybody's equal and that everybody's equal under the law. And we have laws that are set up where um, our Christian faith tells us things that are wrong, like you can't engage in sexual activity with a child. That's not wrong in all cultures. Polygamy, for example, it's not wrong in all cultures. It is wrong in Christianity. And so this is what I mean by we have these laws like female genital mutilation is another one, right? So in other countries, that's legal. In America, that's not legal. And so one of the things that I thought was really great was John MacArthur, I think his name is. He did a documentary during the coronavirus pandemic. It was called The Essential Church, and he explored this question of when can we disobey the laws of the land? And his conclusion, because he wanted to reopen his church and the law was telling him that he couldn't. And so the conclusion that he came to was we can only disobey the laws of the land when they are in direct opposition to God's word. And in the case of child sexual abuse, that is not in opposition to God's will. God's will is not for children to be sexually abused, and therefore we have to, as Christians, follow that law. And it's against the law to sexually abuse a child. And so I think it's really important that churches have some sort of framework for how to respond when this happens that is in line with God's word. And I know that a lot of people do struggle when these things happen because they have a relationship with the person. They don't want, they think, oh my goodness, our ministry is going to be harmed. Our reputation is going to be harmed. I've had a lot of people, because women do sexually abuse children, but it's a higher percentage of men who do that. And a lot of times men are financially supporting a family. So people will say things like, well, we can't do that because then who's going to protect the family? And all of these things start to come up. But I think this is what I mean by it really takes spiritual warfare to engage this and say, no, even all of those things may be true, but we still have to follow God's word. We still have to do what God tells us to do and get justice for the child and put all of those consequences where they belong and not put them on the child.
Well,
And when you do,
let
go
me,
ahead.
if you don't mind, I want to, because there's so much to unpack and I want to remember to address it. So
Hmm.
pardon my interruption, but okay, I think most of us would agree that, okay, working through this, we know that having sex with a child is not only immoral, it is absolutely deplorable, evil, and disgusting. And most of us would probably agree that adultery is in line with that as well. So what I'm hearing you say is a is that the church is culpable in that when sexual child abuse arises, generally speaking, the church is very much about covering up those things, particularly as it relates to their ministry or what they perceive as the frailty of their ministry.
Mhm.
And I don't know what the stats look like. Do you? What is yeah, what does that look like realistically?
So one of the stats that I do know, it's not Christian specific, but what I do know is only about 12% of known CSA child sexual abuse cases are reported to the authorities. And as we were talking about, the known CSA cases are probably just a small portion of the actual ones. And then from those, only 12% are reported to the authorities. And so it's people are not reporting this, and they're not reporting it for the reason that we just talked about. It's because they know the perpetrator. And a lot of times they are invested in the perpetrator. The perpetrator has embedded themselves in their life if they're part of the community and they know, or they know them as part of their family.
Mhm.
But one of the things that I think is really important to recognize is that when you um, study perpetrators, um, they will tell you straight out what it is that they're doing. And so there, I'll give you an example. There's an interview with a young man who was a youth pastor, and it's the perpetrator who is incarcerated at this time telling this story. And he says, I didn't have any children, and so I had to find some. And so I went to a church and I became a youth pastor. And he said, I went around and I made sure that people could see the good deeds that I was doing. I would offer to, help people, but I would make sure that people knew what I was doing. And I was going out of my way to just become a trusted member of this community. And then he was one of the children that he abused, told on him. And because this child had some behavior problems, the church just completely did not believe her. And so then he was accused a second time by another child. And they said, this again, this is the perpetrator telling the story. He said, and the pastor came to me and said, they because they know that you were accused of this before, they feel like it's a weak spot for you, and so this kid is going to do this again, and I'm sorry for what you're going through. And he just had this big response of support. So he later was incarcerated because he was found with child pornography. And this happens so much. Children come and they tell adults, they say this is happening. Either they don't believe the child or they tell that, and this happens a lot actually with a lot of my clients. I hear this. People say to the child, okay, we'll talk to him. I'm going to say him because more men abuse than women. We'll talk to him, but don't tell anybody about this. And so they're literally telling the child to keep this thing a secret, to push it into the darkness, which is exactly the opposite of what we know we're supposed to do as Christians. But this youth pastor was then incarcerated, and so he had denied vehemently any abuse. And then when he was incarcerated, he ended up saying, I think he said it was 86 children that he had abused. But this is very deliberate, and I think people really struggle with that. They think, oh, he's a really good person. I've seen him do all these things. But when somebody wants to abuse a child, they will go out of their way, and almost every abuser is a serial abuser.
Well, and I'm telling you, I'm in the camp where no, I don't, I believe everything. And
Hmm.
I've seen everything. And I have a friend who wrote a book I should connect you to. It's called Broken to Beautifully Whole. Kathy
Hmm.
Studer, she was abused by her stepfather growing up, and her stats are astounding. I can't remember, but the vast majority, a very, very high percentage of children are telling the truth when they bring this stuff up. We can be
Yeah.
assured, we know that if a child is making this kind of statement, it's probably true in all
Yes,
likelihood.
absolutely.
Um, and what I loved about her story was, unlike so many, and it's just absolutely just mind blowing that parents aren't this way. Um, when her mom found out that her stepfather was doing this, she looked her in the eye and said, "This stops now."
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it was dealt with severely.
Mm-hmm.
If only parents could do that. I don't know. I'm just a mother bear. I was ready to gouge out the eyes of anyone, who did my kid wrong. I'm just going to say.
Yeah.
So that to me is terrible. And then especially with the stuff that came out in the Mike Winger report, one of many last week, um, regarding mega churches, one in particular. I'm just astounded that time and again that we as believers are more worried about what is going to happen to our ministry than believing in a God who can protect that through our response in the correct way, doing the right thing,
Mm-hmm.
protecting children. And that verse always comes to mind, better a millstone be placed around his or her neck than to
Mm-hmm.
do any harm in any fashion, physical, mental, or otherwise emotional, to any of
Mm-hmm.
his children.
Yeah.
So we're getting it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is why our God is done with his
Yeah.
bride, because his bride is just not pure. And we've been
Mm-hmm.
hearing this for far too long. And this is the easy part of it. I mean, not the easy part of it. This is the part of it that is not as crazy as some of the stories I've heard in the church with the cover-ups and the intentional banding together by
Mm-hmm.
multiple individuals to do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So what is, Veronica, what's the first step? I mean, I think what you're saying is the first step is an awareness, an understanding that this stuff unfortunately happens everywhere, in every institution, government, office, home,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to come to terms with that and
Yeah.
not and step out of the land of rainbows and unicorns and understand this is a reality, and it's a reality that hurts our children, our future, all of posterity.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, how do we take action? And I'm one of those. I'm not in the camp where I don't understand the camp that says, not my business, or want to protect. Frankly, don't want to judge, but your grandparents, are you kidding me? Come
Yeah.
on, come
Yeah.
on. Um, yeah, what's our next step?
Yeah, so I think just to give you a little response to what you were saying about false allegations, about 8 to 10% of allegations are false. And here's the thing, again, with our justice system, people have to be aware that the justice system is on top of these issues. And forensic interviewers, when a child reports sexual abuse, they know what the red flags are for false allegations, and they look for them. So if a child is making an accusation and you do what you're supposed to do, which is report it to the authorities, in that investigation, those people specialize in this topic. And so if there's a false allegation, there are specific red flags, and they will look for those. And it is very likely that that will be discovered. Almost certainly it will be discovered. But the truth of the matter is that most children minimize abuse. And so when they tell and they're telling their story, so I'm a therapist, and so one of the things that happens in therapy is that we recognize that there's that you can only handle so much trauma at a time. You know, you can't jump to the worst possible, most traumatic moment that has ever happened, you know, when you first begin therapy. You have to, well, you know, unpack those things. You know, you have to unpack it and say, okay, this is sort of like how it started and sort of build up to understand it. But I think that there's a lot of things that we can do as a community. And so the first one is that we can recognize that the justice system is the place that is supposed to deal with crime, and that engaging in sexual activity with a child is a crime. And so we have to think about it in the framework of, if someone else murdered someone at church, do you deal with that within the church? No, but you don't do that because it's a crime. You have to call the police and when a crime takes place. If somebody comes to you and says, you know, I held up a bank, you know, and I feel bad about it and I'm sorry, you don't keep that a secret either. That's not how the church is meant to work. We're not meant to keep secrets. We're meant to shine light on things and help people to walk their Christian journey, and to protect the innocent and the powerless. And so I think that's part of it. And I think that's really important because a lot of times in my practice, I've worked with a lot of families, and um, the concept of grace is really something that I think we need to unpack a little bit more, because so many times
Agree.
um, churches and families will say, well, shouldn't we just give him grace? He said he's sorry. You know, he's crying. You know, we've discovered him, and isn't that our responsibility to embrace him now? And I think that that's something that we need to recognize. Grace means that as the person is accepting the consequences of what they've done, you can still love them. And I know a lot of people are called to do prison ministries. You know, if you have a family member who is incarcerated or on probation, or, you know, is a registered sex offender, you can still go visit that person and talk to them. And I think sometimes that is partially what stops people from being able to follow the law, which is that they think, oh my goodness, if I do this, then, you know, fill in the blank, my best friend, my dad, my brother, my sister, whoever is going to be just an outcast for the rest of their life. They will have to be watched for the rest of their life because, as I said before, almost every abuser is a serial abuser. Um, but that's protecting children. So that is a good thing that they're watched. But we have to recognize that them following that path it's not a condemnation. It's a safety. We're keeping them safe. We're giving them an opportunity to repent and to, you know, embrace salvation for themselves. And then we're also keeping the child safe. And the way that the justice system is set up, on the other side of that, so think about the negative thoughts and feelings that we were talking about before, where I was saying I came to all of these negative conclusions about myself. You know, like there's something wrong with me. You know, nobody cares what happens to me. The world is dangerous, and there's no way to be safe. And these are all very specific PTSD conclusions that people draw about themselves, about community, about the world. It's okay if people hurt me. You know. And when you follow the justice system, now imagine a child tells, they're believed, the adults in the community take action, the abuser is held responsible, and then on the other side of that, the child has reached safety. Now think about the conclusions that the child draws in that situation. People do care about me. While I am loved, I can rely on people. You know, there is trust in this community.
Yeah.
So those are some things that we can do in terms of, if it happens, the response. Preventatively, I think that we need to get a little bit more comfortable in our communities with talking about sex,
Mhm.
private parts, bodies, these types of things. I think, you know, when I was growing up, um, nobody in my community talked to adults about these things. And people are getting a little bit better at this,
Right.
but I think that we need to continue to grow in that area. And there's some really good Christian books. I think there's one called God Made All of Me. Um, and they're good pictures, bad pictures. And pornography now is a big part of the grooming process for abusers. A lot of times abusers start now by showing children some inappropriate pictures, and then that grows. And so good pictures, bad pictures, there are two versions, one for very young children and then one for a little bit older, middle and high school students that talks about pornography. And so I think we can get a little bit better about um, talking directly to our children about, private parts, how to say no. I think historically there's a little bit, you want to teach your children to respect their elders and to, allow themselves to be guided by adults. But we also need to teach our children that adults can also be harmful. And how do you deal with that within your family and your community?
Well, I
And
was going to say, let me interject because I was thinking, I love discussion, especially as it relates to grooming in church. And I know that's one of the things that I saw in your bio was about grooming in church. And I would like you to tell me a little bit about that in terms of grooming, because those people in the church communities that are grooming children, they're not probably showing them photographs, right? What does that look like? And then I had another question. Oh, it escaped my mind, but just that one first. What does it look like in the church to groom?
So the grooming process is sort of, I would say it's kind of an inversion of how God made us to engage in intimate romantic sexual relationships. So if you think about how adults come together, so let's just say you have a Christian couple and we'll say that a guy, what does he do when he wants to get married? Let's say what's the first thing he does? He has to find the woman, right? He targets her. He says, okay, that is the woman that I think I'm in love with right now. And then he has to engage with her. He has to build trust with her. He has to talk with her and get her to see him in a certain way. And then he inserts himself into her life in some way to show like we can have some sort of partnership here. But then, so there's a relationship and a trust building process. And then on the other side of that, then there becomes this, at some point you engage in romance. And so how do people do that? They start by holding hands, they start by maybe, putting their arm around the person. And at some point, you try to increase the touch, the boundaries, you kind of try to see if that's okay with the person and you get a sense of how they're going to react. And then at some point there's physicality, you kiss or you move forward with that. So grooming is sort of the devil's way to do that with children. So people who are grooming children, that's sort of the process. So they target, they think, okay, I want to try to abuse that child. And then they engage in a relationship with the child. They try to build some trust. And then they start to try to kind of see how the child reacts. Maybe they'll, hold their hand a little bit, or they'll try to increase those situations of touch to see how the child is going to react. And it always starts small and then it grows and grows and grows until there's an opportunity for actual abuse. And that can look like a lot of things. You asked about what that might look like in church, like do they show pictures? I mean, everybody has a phone now and it has the internet on it. And so abusers can, you could be in a standing outside waiting for the parents to come, and the abuser, and this is what we call it, opportunistic abuse. So abusers will typically abuse the number of children that they have the opportunity to abuse. And so every time there's an opportunity, they will take it. And so if they find themselves alone standing outside and there are no cameras around, that would be a time when they might say, hey, look at this, picture. What do you think about that? And maybe it starts out with, not full pornography, but just an inappropriate picture. Dirty jokes are something that a lot of times we'll hear people say, special treats, and so this draws the child in. And so, and makes the child feel like they've done something wrong because the abuser will often say, I'm giving this to you, but don't tell anybody because nobody else can know, and this is only for us and only for you. So they create a little bit of secrecy in there.
So I wondered about that, because
Mhm.
I wondered, certainly we can see the parallels when it comes to olders too, and the
Mhm.
manipulation and grooming of not just children, but young adults and so forth. Um, and so you wonder, why wouldn't a child tell the parent what was going on? And then that gets back to, discussion, which is your emphasis, because I consider the way that I raise my own children. If you ever have a situation that looks like this, come to me. If you ever hear somebody tell you to keep a secret from me, that's a red flag. Come to me, let me know. And
Mhm.
one of those moments was just even, and this had nothing to do with this, but I always told my kids, if somebody says they want to beat you up or something, then come and let me know. And there was my son saying, yeah, this kid down the street said he was going to kick my butt if I said anything to you, and he was going to take my bike. And I said, well, this is the right response. Let's go have at it. And I talked to the parents, and we never had another issue again. It was about communication. So
Mhm.
that just leads me to think, again, in these situations, it's just the complacency, and it's not, it's innocent complacency, right? I mean, it's not born of any sin
Mhm.
inherent in us. It's just that a lot of times we trust people, and
Mhm.
until that trust is broken, we have no concept of this
Mhm.
kind of thing or the necessity for protecting against this kind of thing. So that
Yeah.
makes sense. So therefore, we get back to full circle, having the conversation from the beginning, letting the kids know this is the way the world looks. I know with my own kids, and I've really appreciated the fact that they've done this. There is, first of all, well, we did this, no sleepovers. We just don't do them. End of
Mhm.
discussion. Everybody may groan about that, but the reality is we can't control what happens outside of our environment. And although Mr. and Mrs. Jones may be great, Uncle Bob that comes by their house or brother so and so may not be. So we just limit all of those contacts.
Mhm.
And the other thing is what my kids have started doing, which I really appreciate, is not telling their kids, "Hey, go hug this guy, or give your
Oh,
uncle a kiss,
yeah.
or your,
Mhm.
hug your aunt goodbye." It's none of that. That needs to stop, because that's a cultural thing that has lent itself to trouble. And I think
Mhm.
it's just little things like that. If we're just cognitively sensitive of
Yeah.
those kinds of things, we can take measures that'll really have the child thinking differently about who or she is in the world, and the
Yeah.
ability to react to that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really love about some of the books that are out for children and teens, like the God Made All of Me and Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, there's a whole bunch of them. If you look, I'm sure people can find them. But that it just opens up a conversation, and it kind of gives you a language for how do I talk about this? Because I think sometimes people it can be a little bit awkward to talk about, how do I talk about, like, tell my child that somebody might want to harm me
Mhm.
or harm them. It can be difficult. And so I really encourage people to seek out resources. And there really are a lot of Christians who are engaging with this topic. And, I know that a lot of times in the news we hear, and as we should, we hear about these cases of concern. On the other side of that, as we talked about before, God is mobilizing his people to deal with this issue. And so one of the things, we've talked about what maybe parents can do and maybe reframing some of that cultural stuff to say, wait a second, the world is different now. We need to help our kids adapt to that. There's also an organization, it's called Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. And they have multiple tiered programs, but I think their basic one is just safeguarding. And so churches can reach out to Grace and talk to them about how do I create policies and how do I um, create a church environment that is safe for children. And again, I think, as we look at the body of Christ, I think it's a good thing to sort of say, okay, who has God called specifically to answer this question? And I think Grace is a great example of a group of people who have come together to specifically address the question of how do we create a safe environment for children at church, where there are many perpetrators who see almost every church has a kids program.
And it's only been in recent years, I think, that churches are starting to take a little more responsibility. I just think
Mhm.
they were so zealous before about getting out there and doing good things and taking kids to a soup kitchen. And
Yeah.
so I have a daughter who's in her 30s now, but when she was, I guess, in middle or high school, the church that we were a part of sent the kids on a mission trip. And there was a soup kitchen, and there was someone in the soup kitchen that wasn't vetted.
Mhm.
And honestly, I think, back then, I don't know that we even did background checks,
Yeah.
but I was so grateful her brother, and she wouldn't mind me telling the story because she'd tell it herself. She actually works for a church now in a communications department. Um, Her brother was on the trip with her older brother, thank heavens. And she knew from the way that this man was behaving that it was going to be a problem. And he ordered her into a walk-in freezer to get something. And she turned around to another girl who was with him and she says, "Go get my brother now." And the girl raced off, got the brother. So he walked in just as Kelsey's instructed to get up on a ladder and to grab something. And then the guy groped her, but her brother walked in and saved the day. And I was
Mhm.
furious. And I brought that up to the church, tried to explore all of the avenues, met on deaf ears. They didn't
Mhm.
care.
Yeah.
It wasn't about that. It was about the presentation to the parents and doing good things and good works and getting the kids out to do these things. They just had no concept, to my mind, about
Mhm.
how to protect the kids. So that was it.
Yeah.
So the other siblings and those siblings that were on that journey as well were never allowed to go. We never let our kids go on mission trips after that because they weren't properly vetted. And we've all heard the stories.
Mhm.
Even just sitting around recently having a glass of wine with an adult daughter and her adult friend who talked about going out to Nepal on a mission trip with a very well-known man's family and how she was abandoned there.
Mhm.
And had to fend for herself because she didn't want to go up the mountain or something. And so there she was. She was simply left.
Mhm.
And the atrocities, to my mind, just keep coming. And I just think,
Mhm.
at what point are we going to change, not only within the church, but as a society as a whole, to more, I don't know, deductive reasoning when it comes to protecting our kids, our families?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so important to do it because and so this is what the enemy does, he wants to come in and mess up God's work. And that is really a lot of times what the perpetrator is doing, right? You have a group of people who want to put on a ministry or camp or missions trip, and these things are wonderful, and it's great to do those things. But when you have a perpetrator that's, as you said, not properly vetted, or the kids don't know what to do, or there's no plan in place or there's no context that anybody has for what to do if something like this happens, um, well, then it's going to be ruined, and it's actually going to be harmful. And that's why I think, my hope is that the church can start to become more proactive in looking at this issue. And that's why I love the Grace organization. I love talking to the kids about it. I haven't been to a lot of churches who do this well, but my husband and I lived in Denver for a little while, and the pastor shared during a sermon. He did this really interesting thing. He said he was going to have a sermon series that was going to be rated. I think there were like 8 of them, and he said, it's for parents because we are going to talk about some things in this church, but I want to tell you ahead of time. And so for the next 8 weeks, each of the sermons is going to be rated. And so at the beginning, he would say, today's sermon is rated PG-13. So if you have a child that's under 13, take them to the children's program. And then at some point, he said, today's is rated R. So if you're 18 and under, you need to go to the children's program. This is for adults. And he really addressed some of these topics in the church. He shared that he was a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And he also, in a different sermon, he had his therapist come and they set up lounge chairs and they just talked about trauma and how do we look at this? How do we deal with this in our church? And it was just such a unique way, I think, of kind of opening up a conversation with people about this. So I think we have to get creative and I think we have to be bold. We have to stand firm. These are issues that really cause people to be very uncomfortable. And we have to be okay with stepping into some discomfort.
Oh, 100%. Discomfort aside, come on. Anything else is negligent at the very least, and at the worst, criminal, to my
Yeah,
mind.
yeah,
And it's rampant.
yeah.
And that's what I think. I think that's at least why we can take some solace in the exposure, because that means with the exposure, there is discussion and there are then safeguards put into place for the
Mhm.
future so that we don't behave as carelessly and recklessly as we have in the past. Oh, let's just do this. Let's go into that. Let's do whatever we're doing, we have to protect our people and we have to protect our young adults too, because I was part of a ministry where we served breakfast to the homeless and it was great. I loved it. I mean, we were able to really make them feel good because we had maple syrup on the table, salt and pepper and butter on the table. It wasn't just a line where you grab a plate and you sit down. And then we would go around and serve refills on coffee and that kind of thing. And even myself, as a mom, had to encounter some stuff.
Hmm.
You can't just send your young adults into such an
Yeah.
environment, or even women of all ages. There's some prudence dictates that we understand what we're dealing with, and we prepare and protect accordingly. And I
Hmm.
just think on all levels we've done that poorly in the church.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I think
so
partially the thing is that it's a lot of symptom management,
Mhm.
right? And so the church is pretty good at symptom management, right? It's like, we're going to go serve food to the homeless. We're going to do food drives and clothing drives, and we're going to open orphanages. And, the church, I think there's a lot of symptom management. And I think that, um, part of what we have to do is to start engaging with the root cause of some of these things. Why are families so fractured that you need a bunch of orphanages? Why are there homeless people in almost every city in America? What is causing these things? And how do we engage with some of the more root causes? And I think that's really hard because it requires us to constantly be pushing back on authority. And I think that's hard for a lot of people to do. And I just think about this happens everywhere. But a lot of people are familiar with the Catholic Church scandal. And
Mhm.
so what they continuously did was to maintain the system of authority rather than helping children. And, the argument oftentimes is, well, look at all of the good the church is doing. We don't want to ruin the church. We don't want to collapse the church. But you really have to think, if you are enabling pedophiles to have access to children and then covering up their abuse, are you really the church, or are you just enabling evil? And so it takes this sort of like constant renewal of, what is it that we are? What are we doing here? And why are we doing it? And sometimes that means that you have to collapse a ministry. Sometimes that means you have to completely reorganize a family. And so we just have to be willing to do that.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. It's past time. And I recognize this has been something that's been prevalent
Mhm.
across history from the beginning of time.
Yeah.
But I think we're entering into a new age, and I would like to believe that most of us are over this, and that
Mhm.
most of us want to know what's happening so that we can respond accordingly. And so, and we're fed up.
Yeah.
Absolutely fed up. And the other thing is, before I forget, I wanted to just mention you talked about the Justice Department and their safety there, but I've even heard within our own government that there's
Mhm.
been all kinds of pedophilia and trafficking. I mean, for crying out loud, and this is hard for me to process, over 400,000 children went missing during the Biden administration that are unaccounted for,
Yeah.
and we have their names.
Yeah.
I want to know about that. I want to know what happened. And if our government has been complicit in it, I want to know.
Yeah.
I do. And it has to change. No more
Yeah.
of this. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, and so I want to clarify this. You're absolutely right. There is so much corruption, government corruption, and I think as the Epstein files come out, people are already having to resign from positions, and some people are at least being held socially accountable, if not legally accountable. So there's a lot of corruption there. I think the difference is that in the justice system itself, it's meant to be played out in the light. So if what I tell parents and community members is that if you call the police and it's reported, that plays out in the light. Okay, so the police will come to, there are definitely corrupt people who are in these
Right,
positions as well,
right.
but that happens everywhere and we have to deal with that as well. But as that's played out, the accusation is made, then an investigation occurs. And then there's a charge, there's an forensic interview, there's all of these things that happen. And then there is a seeking of the truth that happens in court, that is based on evidence. And you get to be judged by a jury of your peers. And then in sentencing, they take into account your history, your position, what happened. And so they look at you holistically. So that process that's played out in the light, um, I think is a holy process when it's done correctly. And I think, like the Larry Nassar case, for example, I thought that was just a really beautiful
Yeah.
expression of what can happen when somebody who is a serial abuser, when the survivors come together and advocates come together and everybody is doing the job that they're meant to do to expose evil, shine light, and then to focus on protecting the children and then laying the consequences with the abuser. And then, to be honest, I do hope that Larry Nassar gets saved in prison. I hope that he has that experience. And so it really is, when it's played out well, it's really, I think that it's a whole expression of how Christ wants us to be in the world.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. So before I let you go, tell us what is your goal, Veronica? Why are you so visible right now? You have your practice and you have your clients that you see, and you're on that level, you're absolutely making the world a better place. I truly believe that whatever calling has been instilled upon us, it is for the betterment of the kingdom. It is for
Mhm.
we're called to make the world a better place in our own way.
Mhm.
So now that you're going public, like and coming on shows like mine, what is your end goal with all of that?
Yeah, my end goal is, if I had to put it all in one phrase, I would say healing is not done in isolation. And so I'm currently writing a book, probably will be out at some point this year. And my goal there is to help families and communities to know what to do when it's discovered that a child has made an accusation against somebody that they've been sexually abused. And I think a lot of times what happens is people just send their child directly to therapy, and I'm a therapist, so I've dealt with that a lot. And that a lot of times people think that's all they have to do. Okay, my child's in therapy, and then we can all move on and go on with our lives. My goal, my end goal, is to have a conversation with the Christian community about the seriousness of this, the consequences of it, the prevalence of it, and then to be very concrete about what to do and to help people to mobilize around dealing with this as a community, instead of thinking that the child is meant to individually heal on their own after this. That's not how God created us. He did not create us in isolation to be in isolation. He created us to be a part of a community. And when somebody has this level of evil perpetrated against them, they need their community.
So, what does that look like in a community for each individual who may be reticent to talk about what they've experienced?
Mhm. Yeah, I would say that as a survivor myself, I feel a lot of empathy for survivors who feel like everything feels like it's my responsibility. I have to go to therapy. I have to do the healing. I have to be the one who brings this up to the community. And I have experienced those feelings myself.
Mhm.
But I've to this point where I feel so convicted by the Holy Spirit that this issue is important enough for me to be uncomfortable. And so I put myself out there. I say I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I'm talking with people at my church right now about, how can I play a role here in protecting children. And so it's really about and trying to and doing that work of rebuilding trust with people and creating communities. There's a great book called Journey to Heal. It's a book for female survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Maybe buy that. It's a Bible study, and post that on your church website as a group that you can do. And so it, I would say, just lean into that healing, even though it's hard. That's what spiritual warfare is about.
Well, and what I'm hearing you say, which is great, and thanks for clarifying that, it's not so much about bringing attention to a specific child in the moment that that child
Mhm.
experiences it, but this is what perpetrators don't understand. They grow up. and they
Hmm.
talk about it.
Yeah.
So, as adults coming together and being willing to share information so that collectively that helps the community. And I
Hmm.
think that the first goal is and is always just letting kids know, young adults know, whoever that is experienced it know this isn't your fault and you don't have to take that on.
Yeah.
Um, because I know for personal experience that there's blame there that we attach, right? So in my case, and I've never gone public with this, but it was a pro ball player. And
Mhm.
I blamed myself. I was in an environment where I was drinking alcohol. So, and I've talked about it later on, and I had a friend who actually played for the Yankees, and he said, if I had known, and I said, nobody would have known at the time
Yeah.
because when I was younger, I wouldn't have discussed it. It was my problem. I was
Hmm.
to blame. So I think when we have these very frank conversations with one another, then it really does foster an environment that could look a little different in the future and protect us all. So,
Yeah.
and and those kids don't need to feel pressure at this point, other than they feel a a sense of community that is less spoken about and more felt as
Yeah.
as people rally around them and believe what they have to say. And that's why I really just need you to get in touch with. I'm going to put you guys in touch, you and my friend that wrote the book Broken to Beautifully Whole,
I
Kathy
would love
Studer, because she is
that.
works with NCAN. Is it NCAN? In anyway, various agencies, organizations rather, that are bound and determined to stop this nonsense.
Yeah. If you're out there and someone discloses abuse to you, a child, we're trained because as a therapist who specializes in this, I'll give you one concrete thing before we go. We're trained for three phrases. I believe you. You didn't do anything wrong, and it's okay that you told me. So, and those are directly in opposition to the grooming process. So that's how you can start. And then, seek out community if this happens and seek out wise counsel as we're directed to do in the Bible. And God will guide you to do the right thing, but we have to be willing to engage in the spiritual warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today. When your book comes out, let's connect again and get you back on so that we can highlight that for people. I think um, my suspicion is that the percentages are a lot higher than we've talked about today.
Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
that for anyone tuning in today, it's resonated
Mhm.
because chances are, if you're tuning in today and you're hearing this, there's some part of the conversation that hit home for you.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
just know you're not alone, and the Lord loves you, sees you, and wants your healing. And I'll have all of Veronica's information in the show notes. So if you would like to contact Veronica, then I will have that for you.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you, Veronica, for coming on the show today. God's blessings to you and all in your calling and what you're doing. It's fantastic.
Thank you.